Hello everyone, welcome back to Political Science. In this video, we're going to continue looking at the US Constitution, how it came to be formed. We're going to be looking at the experiences of the colonists, and we're going to be charting that road to the American Revolution. In this video, we're asking the question, how is it that the colonists turned from loyal subjects of the king into rebels? In other words, we're asking the question, what was it that made them so ticked off that they decided to fight a war with their own country and try to break away? And so that's what we're going to try to explore in really a brief history lesson. If you look at an American flag, there are 13 stripes. And of course, that's because there were those 13 original British colonies, all the way from New England in the north down into the south, with the southernmost colony being Georgia. Now, there were some big differences. Of course, they were all English colonies, as we saw in our last video. Some of them were set up for business or profit motive, like the Jamestown colony in Virginia. Others were set up with an idea of more trying to seek religious freedom, like the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. One of the most important differences between those northern colonies and the southern colonies was the institution of slavery. Slavery was widespread in the southern colonies. There was a very active slave trade taking place. And then, of course, in the southern economy, enslaved people were doing a lot of cash crops. So you think about, big crops like tobacco and so forth. So the southern economy was very rural, it was very agricultural. You had a very huge reliance on slavery. You didn't see so much slavery in the northern colonies. These colonies tended to be less well suited for wide-scale agriculture. There were small farms, but their economies were more varied. There was more shipbuilding, there was more logging and so forth like this. So their economies were a bit less reliant entirely on agriculture. So that is the world that we're entering into as we do our exploration. You have a number of people from England coming over and setting up colonies, but they really weren't the only ones who were staking out territory in the New World. The other two major European powers that were also trying to come over and to take over some of this land were, of course, the French and the Spanish. And what I want you to look at right now is this map. Actually, there's two maps on the screen. These are the pre-war boundaries of 1754 and then the post-war boundaries. What war is he talking about? Well, I'm talking about the French and Indian War. It's really important for you guys to know about this war because what happens in the aftermath is really going to set the stage for all of those tensions between the colonists and the king, and by extension, everybody in England, that's going to lead to this bloody revolution. So what was the French and Indian War? We can think of the French and Indian War of being one part of a broader war called the 7 Years' War. And this was a war that pitted multiple European powers against each other, spread out throughout the globe. So the French and Indian War is the one we care about for this lecture because it's the part that happens within North America. It's called the French and Indian War because on the one hand, you have the British, and they're fighting against the French. If you look at that, the map that you see in front of you here, you've got those pink areas, those are controlled by England, and you've got those orange areas that were claimed by France. And of course, you see that there's a sliver in between where both countries have laid claim to that territory. So the French and Indian War, I should note too, the reason it's called the French and Indian War is because both sides had Native American tribes that were fighting as well. And it was really a battle over who would control North America, which European power would lay claim to all of this territory. And as you can see from the map, it's very clear who the winner was. If you look at those 1763 boundaries, the French are nowhere to be seen, really. I mean, you've got, now England claiming all of this territory. And when you think about it, think about it for a second. What does it take to wage a successful war? One of the things that you need is money. It's very expensive. We as Americans, we know all about that because over the last several decades, the United States has been involved in many wars and spent so much money on them. It's true of England at this time as well. They win the French and Indian War, but they go deeply in debt to do it. And by the time that this war is over and you see this new leader step into his role, King George III, the national debt of England had doubled. When you think about debt in your personal life, let's imagine you take out a credit card. You're not just paying back whatever you borrowed, you're paying it back with interest. That's actually a really big problem in the United States today because we have a massive national debt. And a big part of our expenses as a country is servicing that debt. It's paying back the interest on the debt, just like you would pay off the interest on a credit card. Well, that was true of the British as well. Servicing that national debt was taking up a very large portion of their national budget. So something had to be done. King George III comes in. I know he's got white hair in the image that you're looking at on the screen. He was actually very young when he took over. He was 22 years old. Some of you watching this are probably about the same age. Those are some pretty big shoes to fill when you step in as king of one of the most powerful countries on earth and you're that young. Now, King George III, he's got to come up with a way of paying down this debt. It's a real problem for the British. And here's what you really need to know in this part of the lecture. The way that they decide to pay off the debt is they are going to levy some taxes on the colonists. We're going to talk about those taxes. Now, one of the important things to know about these taxes that we're about to talk about is that they were only levied on the colonists. This meant that if you were an English citizen who lived in London or Birmingham or any other English town or city, you didn't have to pay these. But if you lived in the colonies, you were paying the taxes. Now, the idea behind this was kind of this recognition that, hey, we won all of this territory for you. We protected you against the French. You're benefiting from this. And so you should pay the bill for it. The people that were living in the colonies became very upset by these taxes. Number one, for reasons we'll get into later, they objected to the very idea that they should be taxed because they couldn't consent to it. But number two, like most people today, nobody really likes paying taxes, right? We'd rather have that money. It makes things more expensive. It makes it harder for us to stretch our money. Add this into the mix of a situation where colonists already sort of have that distance away from England, where they've had their own self-rule for such a long time, and you could understand why they were maybe feeling upset about that. Let's look at two of these taxes that really impacted the colonists. The first one that we're going to look at is something called the Sugar Act, 1764. Why do people like sugar today? Well, of course, it's easy. We can make all kinds of nice stuff with it. We can make great tasting food. And of course, today you walk into a grocery store or you walk into whatever, drive down PCH in Los Angeles and you've got like a million different places you can go eat. It wasn't really like that in the 1700s, right? Having access to staples like sugar could be really important for your day-to-day life. But not only sugar was taxed, there was also molasses that was taxed and, cane sugars and so forth. And one of the things that you can do with sugars and with molasses is, of course, you can make rum. And so this Sugar Act also placed a tax on rum. Think about it today. We have like endless kind of opportunities for us to have entertainment. You can turn on Netflix if you want after you're done with this video, although I think you should finish reading chapter 2 before you do that. But probably not as many entertainment options, right? When you're living in the colonies in the 1700s. So if you want to have a good time with your friends, you might be drinking some rum as well. It's going to raise the price of rum. Now, what ends up happening in the following year, 1765, we end up with the Stamp Act as well. Stamp Act, when I first heard about the Stamp Act, I thought, okay, well, stamps, that's like mailing stuff, right? When I go to the post office, I have to put the stamp on the envelope. That's not what the Stamp Act is. The Stamp Act was an act that was put in place. It was a tax that basically said if you ever wanted to purchase paper goods, let's say like a newspaper, magazine, book, all of you are students, right? You might even be taking notes on paper right now as you watch this video. If you wanted to buy those things, they had to have an official government stamp on them. And actually, if you look at the slide right here, that is what the official stamp looked like. You had to make sure that that stamp was on there. You're gonna have to pay an extra fee for it. If that stamp is not on there, you're gonna be getting in trouble because it's perceived that you have illicitly obtained that information or that material. This was also placed on entertainment goods like playing cards, like dice. Another reason it impacted students is because if you wanted to get a diploma, of course, that's printed on paper. You're paying the tax on that. Any sort of legal transaction, let's say you want to do a contract with somebody, you want to buy some property, you want to marry somebody and get a marriage license, you're paying that stamp, you're paying that tax. It was seen as, very disruptive. All of you have been on social media at one point and you have seen political memes. And we like to think that we're so new and modern. We make all these memes and whatnot. They were doing that back in the 1700s too, right? So again, this is what the original stamp looked like right here. And this is the equivalent of a 1700s meme right there on the right. And that's what somebody had kind of posted up. And that, was the equivalent of that going viral. They saw the stamp and that skull and crossbones. Now, people were upset about the taxes. Nobody likes to pay taxes because it's expensive. So you're thinking about, tax on various goods. The expense of it was only one part of it. Something that really riled up the colonists as well was this idea of taxation without representation. And this is going to be a really important idea in the debates that are going to follow. Colonists wanted to put up some sort of an opposition. It's not just that they were taxed that they felt was unfair. And it's not just that they were singled out as being colonists. Remember, the people back in England weren't paying the tax. It was that under the English Bill of Rights, there was an expectation that people should consent to the level of taxation. And the way that they do that is through Parliament. If you lived in London and you hated the taxes, there was somebody that you could talk to. You could go to your member of Parliament and try to get the law changed. But if you lived in the colonies, you did not have representation. There was nobody that you could send to Parliament. If you sent, a delegate from the colonies and you tried to have them go take a vote in Parliament, that person would get kicked out. They didn't have a seat. Today, you have representation. If you don't like the laws in the United States, you can go to your member of Congress or your senator. You can try to get those laws changed. So one of the things that they objected to was the fact that they could not send representatives to Parliament to make decisions about what was impacting them at the local level. As a result, they felt like you had to get rid of the tax. So the colonists are going to come together. They're going to resist the taxes. And the way that they do this is going to set a foundation for future meetings as well. So what the colonists decide to do is to call something called the Stamp Act Congress. The call goes out asking the various colonies to send representatives to all come together in one gathering place and have a discussion. How can we fight back against what we feel are unfair taxation practices? And when they come together at the Stamp Act Congress, they make a decision. We're going to first voice our concerns to the king. We're going to tell him why we object. But we're also, in the meantime, until these taxes are repealed, we're going to boycott all British goods. Now, I want you to think about that term boycott for a second. What does it mean? A boycott is a form of political protest. You decide to stop buying an item because you want to make a political point. Sometimes people might stop buying a product because they feel like that brand isn't very good. So for instance, maybe you buy one brand of shoes and they fall apart and you're like, I'm never going to buy that brand again. That can happen. That's not what we're talking about with a boycott. Of course, a boycott, we are making a statement. We're not going to buy that good because we disagree on politics. You see boycotts happen from time to time, even in American life today. So why would they do that? Well, they want to use the power of their pocketbook to put pressure on British businesses and British interests, who in turn will put pressure on political leaders to change the policy. And this is what's so cool about the Stamp Act Congress, is that they were actually successful. They came together, and after this boycott began, it was only a matter of time until those laws, the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, were actually repealed. So here you've got the colonists coming together. They're coming together across colony lines. They're voicing opposition to a British policy, and they're actually winning. Now, that's an amazing story right there. But unfortunately for the colonists, that's not where it ends. So in 1767, not that long after, we see the imposition, unfortunately, of some new taxes called the Townshend Acts. After all, there's a huge war debt to be paid off, and it's not going to pay itself, so the taxes are back on. The most famous of all of these taxes, you've probably learned about this going through your K-12 education, is the tax on tea. And, tea, of course, was a staple. It still is in British life. And many of the colonists enjoyed tea. One of the reasons that Americans today are more of a coffee culture is because during the Revolution, we had that boycott on British tea and began importing more coffee around that time. It was almost seen as an act of resistance to prepare coffee in your home. So next time you're sipping on your Starbucks, maybe you'll think back to this early colonial experience. The Townshend Acts also placed taxes on things like glass and lead and paint, a lot of products that were very important for industrial work that was happening at that time as well. So you can see that it would raise the prices on consumer goods and products. People were not happy with these taxes. Around this time, you begin to see more agitation. You begin to see more conflict. Of course, the image that you see here represents the Boston Massacre, which happened in 1770. It was not uncommon to find British troops that were stationed in the colonies. They're famous for wearing these red coats. And actually, that's how they were referred to by the colonists, as the redcoats. Now, in Boston in 1770, you had a large group of colonists who got together, and they started booing and jeering at this group of soldiers and ended up throwing snowballs at them. And in the image here, you can see what happens. The soldiers fire on the crowd, and 5 people were killed. This turns up the temperature greatly. And during this period of time, there's still this opposition. There's still this sense of conflict, right, between the colonists on the one hand and the English on the other. In 1773 is going to be another very important event that happens in Boston once again, and that is the Boston Tea Party. As you look at the image here, what do you see? You see men who appear to be dressed as Native Americans, and they seem to be on board a boat with axes. What's happening? You probably know the story already. There were about 100 men. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty. And in the middle of the night, they board a British ship that was loaded with tea, and they're disguised as Native Americans. It's really sort of a recognition of their identity as North Americans, as separate and distinct from English people. And they get aboard the boat, and also it's useful for a disguise as well, right? Because if you're engaged in this act of vandalism and potential for violence, you don't want to be identified. So anyway, they get aboard this boat. They start taking the axes to these crates of tea, and for, I believe, 3 hours, just throw everything overboard. Today, this would be considered millions of dollars worth of damage. And as you can imagine, the British officials and the king were very unhappy about this situation. And that's going to lead to a series of acts that are passed that are really going to rattle the colonies and really impact their lives, especially Massachusetts, in a major way. Before we get to the coercive acts, why don't we take a look at this image right here? What is that? What are we looking at here? Now, if you attend LA Harbor College and you look at this image, it's going to be very familiar from you. This is just a stone's throw away. I feel like you could walk up on top of one of the buildings on our campus and you look across and you see the Vincent Thomas Bridge there. That's the bridge that connects San Pedro over to Long Beach and that area. And if you look underneath, what do you see? You see the Port of LA. It's one of the most important ports, arguably the most important port in the United States today. It's certainly the largest. What kind of things go in and out of this port? A lot, right? Think about everything that you might go to and buy in a store, whether that's Costco or Target or any other store. A lot of that stuff likely came in and out of this port. We import vehicles. We import all kinds of food, textiles and clothing, and maybe even the device that you're watching this on. If you live in Los Angeles, maybe it even came through this port. And of course, there's a lot of businesses in California that also really depend on this port so that we can ship stuff out. Think about all the farmers that, they grow their food here in California and they ship it to other parts of the world. There is so much going on right here. It's very important. I want you to imagine, especially if you live in Los Angeles, imagine that today you get news that last night a bunch of guys got on board of a boat and they caused a lot of damage. You might be happy about that or maybe really upset about that. Ultimately, at the end of the day, though, you feel like, it wasn't me who was on board that boat, so I shouldn't be punished for it. And I think it's fair to say that we would all feel that way today. Now, that's not exactly what happened. And these coercive acts that were passed by the British were called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. In other words, they reframed it because coercive, it means coerce means to change your behavior. Intolerable is how they saw it. We can't put up with it. And as you look at some of these laws, you'll begin to see the reason why. Now, the first thing that we're going to talk about is the Boston Port Act. Now, what ends up happening is they shut down completely the Boston port. All of that conversation that we just had about the Port of LA, imagine if tomorrow that was just shut down. How would our life in Los Angeles change? It would change in a major way. We'd have a much more difficult time getting goods. The goods that were available for sale would likely go up dramatically in price. And if you were a business owner who depended on the port to ship stuff to other areas, you're out of luck because nothing's going in and nothing's going out until that debt is paid off. All of the damages and expenses caused by the Boston Tea Party, you have to pay it back or we're not going to reopen the port for you. This felt really unfair to a lot of people because there were people that had nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party who were now being punished collectively for the decisions of people that were on board that boat on that night. In addition to this, the British came in and they passed something called the Massachusetts Government Act. You remember the charter we talked about in the last video? It's written permission from the king saying that you have the ability to make decisions at the local level. Well, what the Massachusetts Government Act does is it rips that to shreds. That government that you had, the ability to make your own decisions, it's in the dustbin now. And we've got a new governor who is going to be friends with the king, who's appointed by the king, and now he's making the rules. You could imagine how upsetting that would be to the people of Massachusetts, but also to the surrounding colonies, right? If they can do it in Massachusetts, they could also do it in New York and Georgia and everywhere else, right? And so you began to see that level of concern rising on the part of the colonies together. You had something called the Administration of Justice Act, which George Washington called the Murder Act. What this one would have done was, let's say you're a British soldier and you commit a crime in the colonies, rather than standing trial for your crime in the colony where people from the community can come and testify and witness what they saw, they're going to put you on a boat, they're going to ship you back to England, and your trial is going to be held there. The colonists really felt like this gave carte blanche to the soldiers to just commit crimes freely, go back to England where they'll get a favorable trial, and maybe they'll get a little slap on the wrist. And they were very upset with that, as you can imagine. And finally, the Quartering Act would have required the colonists to pay for the room and board of those soldiers that were stationed in the colonies. So not only are they feeling this imposition because, hey, these soldiers are here in our community and we don't like it, but we also have to pay for it as well and find a place for them to stay. So these were all, again, going to be things that are really turning up the temperature during this period of time. You begin to see the colonists fighting back. And we're going to see that once again, colonies were asked to send delegates, those are people representing each colony, to Philadelphia to discuss the concerns that they shared in common. In 1774, we see the First Continental Congress, where the colonists once again decide that the boycott is on. We're going to boycott all British goods. We're going to, again, send a petition to the king saying, we are your loyal subjects. Hey, we want to work it out with you, but we want to see the policies changed. Now, about a year later in 1775, we see the Second Continental Congress where once again, delegates are called to come to Philadelphia. At this time, things are really hot. You begin to have battles breaking out between the British troops and the colonists, the first being Lexington and Concord. So the writing is on the wall at this point. We're headed towards war. This is when George Washington was selected as the commander-in-chief for the Continental Army and the establishment of that shared Continental Army for all 13 colonies. This past July, I had some people over to my house. We had a great time. We were having good food, barbecue, maybe having a couple drinks, and then setting off some fireworks, listening to music. You can probably already guess the reason we were doing that is because it was the 4th of July. What do we do on the 4th of July? Why do we celebrate? Why do we light off fireworks? That day is the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed. 1776 is such an important year for our country because it's essentially the moment where we become our own independent nation. No longer 13 colonies, but now 13 independent states, their own country. In 1776, a lot is happening very quickly. In April, the Continental Congress calls for free trade with every country on planet Earth except for Britain. In other words, we are going to trade with anybody who we want. We're not going to put taxes on your imports, and we're just going to, engage in that relationship with everybody except for one country, very important one, England. In May, the colonists themselves begin ripping up their charters and establishing their own governments without any ties to England. And then, of course, in July 4th, 1776 is where you get the Declaration of Independence. We're going to look at the Declaration in just a moment and talk about why it was so important. Before we do that, though, we have to talk about breakups. And some of you watching this will have been through that experience before of having broken up with somebody. It is really difficult, isn't it? I mean, if you've gone through that before, there's a lot of feelings involved. It can be really challenging. There are a few different ways to break up with somebody. The best way, if you ask me, is face-to-face. You're having a conversation with this person. You're working it out, as difficult as it may be, and saying, hey, it's over. The worst way to break up with somebody is probably ghosting them. You just forget that they exist, or maybe sending them a text message. Not a great way to do it. Please, if you're going to break up with somebody, please don't do that. One very common way that people choose to break up with each other is through a letter. Maybe you sit down and you write a letter to that person. What do you do in that letter? Well, number one, you talk about the relationship a little bit. You talk about maybe the things that the other person didn't do so well at, right? I mean, you forgot my birthday and I think you're a jerk. And not only that, my mom thinks you're kind of a jerk too. My friends don't like you. I just don't see this working out, right? You're going to give it this whole list of like the reasons why it's not going to work out. The Declaration of Independence is kind of like a breakup letter if you really look at it. Now, most of the text of the Declaration is literally a list of things that the colonists are upset about King George III. They call him a tyrant. They say that he's been very unfair in the way that he's treated them. He has called for legislative bodies to meet very far away from the people. He has denied them the right to make laws and decisions for themselves. There's all of these things that he's done that has tyrannized the colonists. And so they list that out in detail in the Declaration of Independence. But the Declaration of Independence is a special document because it's not just a breakup letter. It's also like a mission statement. If you think about a mission statement, like Harbor College, for instance, we have a mission statement. And if we go and we read it, it's at the end of the day, what is our organization about? Like, why do we exist? Why are we here? They'll put that in a mission statement. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence of the United States, it is really like the set of foundational ideas, and it's like the mission statement for the United States. It's as if when we're living up to our very best principles as a nation, this is what we should stand for. Let's take a look at the Declaration. Now you see here a portrait of Thomas Jefferson, again with that cool, fresh, powdered wig. Now he's pretty young when this is painted in 1786, but he would have been even younger in 1776 when he wrote the Declaration. I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to listen to it, and I want you to think about the influences. He says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government." Doesn't this sound just like John Locke? I mean, these words could have been taken from Locke himself. He's saying that it's obvious that all men are created with certain unalienable rights. In other words, those natural rights that we talked about. They're part of your natural identity as a human being. He's even kind of lifting passages from Locke, right? It's not life, liberty, and property. It's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which kind of sounds nicer. It's also really deeply connected to this idea of the American dream, this idea, even today, that Americans feel they should be able to go out and pursue what makes them fulfilled and happy. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted. In other words, the reason that we have governments is to secure the rights. That's something that Locke said and totally agreed with. And not only that, but the authority of the government comes from what? The consent of the governed, another term that we get from Locke. He goes on to talk about the right of revolution. He feels that King George III is a tyrant and that it is the right of people, if they are not having their rights respected, to alter or abolish the government and overthrow it. These are some huge ideas, even in America today. For instance, the idea that we're all created equal, that we have an expectation of equality, the idea of liberty, that we have freedom, that we can make decisions for ourselves. This is so important in the American context today. And so as we look to the Declaration, we can again really look at it as that mission statement or that vision. It has been so influential to the way that Americans have seen the role and purpose of their government and what we're supposed to stand for. Now, I would be remiss not to point out the tension that's also present here in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. This incredible language about liberty and equality. And of course, as influential as Thomas Jefferson is, both here writing the Declaration and then later in his presidency, the fact is that he himself enslaved other human beings. Thomas Jefferson was born into a slave-owning family, and there were hundreds of enslaved people working where he lived. In fact, he himself fathered children with an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings. And so his connection to the institution of slavery was very deep and very personal. And it goes to show that there is this real tension at the time of the American founding. On the one hand, these lofty ideas of equality and liberty, and at the same time, so many people living under a system of slavery that deprived them of their equality and their liberty. This tension is going to remain in place for many years in American life. We're later going to see that it's really the Civil War, a very bloody and violent war, that ends up resolving the issue of slavery through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But the history of segregation and prejudice, of course, extending far beyond that time, which we'll get into in our week on civil rights. So an incredible document, really deeply important to American life. And that leads us really up until the American Revolution, a fascinating topic. We won't be spending much time in this unit exploring the American Revolution. It's obvious that the colonists were successful. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this class on American government. Perhaps our class would look very different if that were the case. What we're really going to be exploring in the next videos is what comes next. Now that we are a new country, that we're no longer connected to England, that there's no longer a king, how are we going to set up our government? And the answer might surprise you. The first try at this ended in failure. We didn't end up with a constitution right away. And we're going to explore that next part of this chapter in American history in our next video. Thank you so much for watching. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the next one.